Hello and welcome to Torah Thoughts. The Torah portion this week, the Parsha of the week, is Vayeshev. And the story that we see in Parshat Vayeshev, it's actually a little bit unusual. It's different than what you see in the other Parshat because it's two stories, but it's not done one and then the next one. The Torah tells us the story, one story, kind of cuts off to a different story and then comes back to the other one. So we start off with the story of Yosef. He is the 11th son of Yaakov's 12 sons. And about Yosef has a little bit of animosity with his brothers. He was Yaakov's favorite son, but he was the second to the youngest one. So the older ones kind of resent that. Yosef kind of brags about some things he dreams, insinuating that he is destined to be the king over his brothers, which ultimately does come true, but his brothers weren't very happy when Yosef was telling them about these dreams he was having. And the animosity builds, and at some point the brothers decide they want to kill him. They throw him into a pit until they figure out what to do with him next. And then Yehuda, the fourth brother, he steps up and he convinces them, look, don't kill him. Sell him as a slave. So, I mean, it kind of seems like... what kind of heroic thing is that when you sell your brother as a slave? But in essence, he was saving Yosef's life at the time. So Yosef gets sold as a slave, and that's how he winds up being taken down to Egypt, where they sell him on the market, literally. And then the Torah breaks away to another story. So now the Torah goes off to the story about Yehuda, which seems totally unconnected to what we were reading just now about the story of Yosef being sold and so on. So it starts off by telling us that Yehuda leaves his father's house and he goes off to live in another town and he gets married. And he has 3 kids. Kids grow up and their names were Onan, and Shelah. So the oldest one, he gets married to a woman named Tamar and he dies. Now, according to Jewish law, and even back then according to tradition, to the tradition of Yaakov's family and probably Avram and Yitzchak as well, when a man gets married and he dies without having any children, the widow now becomes the wife of the next brother, assuming he has a brother. And he has to raise a family with her, so to speak, in the name of the brother who passed away. So dies, and the wife, the widow Tamar, now becomes the wife of the second brother, the second son, Onan. And guess what? Onan dies. So now Yehuda's thinking, okay, the third son, Shelah, is supposed to take Tamar as his wife, but she just killed 2 of his sons. He's thinking, I don't want to lose my third son, and he kind of begins to stall Tamar and says to her, look, yes, you are, you're going to be his wife, but not yet. He's too young. Why don't you go home, live, in your father's house until Shelah is old enough, and then you can come and marry him. So Tamar goes back home to her father, and she waits and waits and waits, and then realizes that Yehuda is never going to come for her. This was just a ploy to get rid of her. So she decides she tricks Yehuda. She disguises herself as a prostitute. She hears that Yehuda is passing by her town, and so she disguises herself as a prostitute. She puts a veil over her face so he doesn't recognize her, and she sits outside the entrance to the town where Yehuda is about to pass by. And Yehuda passes by and she seduces him, and they end up sleeping together. But remember, she's supposedly a prostitute. She asks Yehuda, what are you going to pay me? Yehuda says, well, I'm on a business trip. When I'm going to come back, I'm going to have a flock of goats. I'll give you one of the goats. And she says, okay, but how do I know you're going to do that? You got to give me some collateral. Yehuda says, okay. He gives her his ring, his coat, and his walking staff. Now the ring, remember, it's not just a ring. The ring has a seal on it. Most people back then weren't literate. So what they would do is they would have a certain seal, a certain insignia on their ring. And they would dip the ring into some ink and then stamp it onto a piece of paper. And that's how they would sign their signature. So Yehuda leaves these 3 things with her as collateral, goes off on his business trip. And then when he comes back from his business trip, he sends his partner to go find this prostitute so that he can and pay her so that he can reclaim his collateral. But he doesn't find her. He asks the locals if they know of such a prostitute who sits around this and this place, and they have no idea what he's talking about. There's no prostitute. comes back and Yehuda says, "Oh boy, this is embarrassing. Let's just not talk about it and not tell anyone about it." And then the story, ultimately, Yehuda does find out who she is. He finds out that she tricked her, and he admits that she was right. And she gives birth. She gets pregnant from Yehuda, and she gives birth to a set of twins who are from Yehuda. We'll get back to the details about that in a minute. But the Torah then jumps back to the story of Yosef. Yosef is now in Egypt, right? He's been sold as a slave, and he ends up being purchased by one of the Pharaoh's ministers. His name is Potiphar. And Potiphar's wife, again, in that society, their names go according to the names of the husband. So Potiphar's wife is known as Potiphera. And Potiphar notices that Yosef is very smart, he's very skilled, and he's not just an ordinary slave, and he puts Yosef in charge of his entire house. Yosef is in charge of Potiphar's house, no questions asked. He can do anything he wants. The only thing he can't touch is Potiphar's wife, Potiphera. The problem is Potiphera kind of takes a liking to Yosef, and she tries to seduce him. But Yosef rejects her advances, and Potiphera doesn't like that. So what does she do? She sets him up. She tries to seduce him again when there's no one in the house. Yosef says no. He tries to leave, and she grabs onto his clothing. Yosef runs out, and she's left holding Yosef's clothing. And she begins to yell, cry for help. Eventually, people come, and she accuses Yosef of trying to rape her. And she uses this, "Look, I'm holding his clothing. How did I get it?" And she uses it as proof. And Yosef, of course, he can deny it all he wants. Nobody's going to believe a slave over the wife of a minister. And Yosef winds up going to prison. In prison, he meets two other ministers who have been imprisoned. One is the minister in charge of Pharaoh's winery, and the other one's the minister in charge of Pharaoh's bakery. And the both of them were put in prison because they messed up big time, each with their own jobs, with the wine and with the bread that they were baking. And each of them tells Yosef in prison about a dream that they had. And Yosef interprets the dream. He interprets it as a prediction of something that's going to happen, and he predicts it correctly. One interpretation is that the head of Pharaoh's winery is going to get restored to his position as the head of the winery, and of course that happens. And the other prediction, the dream that the minister in charge of Pharaoh's bakery, he's going to get convicted of the crime that he was accused of, the crime of messing up Pharaoh's bread, and he's going to be executed. And that happens as well. So those are the three stories. Story of Yosef, story of Yehuda, and then back again to the story of Yosef. And you got to wonder what's going on here, and is there a common thread? Why did the Torah write it in such a way? And so the first common thread that I noticed is the idea of a person's clothing. Yosef is identified by, I forgot to mention in the beginning, Yaakov loves Yosef so much that he gives him a shirt or a coat. If you've seen Joseph and the amazing Technicolor dream coat, the whole thing, the coat of many colors. The Torah doesn't tell us it was many colors, but that's not important for the purposes of this conversation. This particular shirt that Yosef has gets ripped off of him when they throw him into the pit, and when they sell him as a slave, they convince Yaakov that he was killed. How? They dip his shirt into the blood of a goat. We'll getting back to details soon. But they dip his shirt into the blood, and they show it to Yaakov. Yaakov realizes it's Yosef's shirt, and he assumes Yosef was killed. Then we see again that Yehuda was identified by Tamar by the collateral that he left behind. Look, I have your coat, and the staff and the ring, of course. But again, the coat is instrumental. And then later on again, Potiphera, she identifies Yosef. She's waving proof. Look, I have his clothing. Honestly, I'm not sure what that means. I know that in two of those cases, it leads to royalty. Yosef going to prison leads to him ultimately identifying the minister's dream. He correctly interprets it and predicts what's going to happen, and that's why Pharaoh later on takes him to interpret his dream. And then, of course, with Yehuda gets identified with that coat, and that leads to Yehuda's sons, the twins that Tamar gives birth to. One of them ends up being the ancestor of King David. So he's the forebearer of the Davidic dynasty, which means Mashiach is a descendant of the baby from this particular pregnancy, where Yehuda was identified by the coat. If anyone has any idea, any further idea of what's the significance of that, I'd love to see something in the comments. I'm just putting it out there. Not exactly sure what that means. But another common thread that we see between these, let's call them three stories, is the concept of midah keneged midah, which means that when God punishes you for something you did wrong, He does it in a way that's similar to what you did wrong. And likewise, when God rewards you, He rewards you in a way that's similar to what you did right. So take a look at the story of Yosef, for example. The Torah tells us that one of the things that Yosef did against his brothers, when the animosity was building, was he would rat them out, basically, to his father. And he would tell his father that the brothers, when they're out in the field, they would take an animal and chop off a portion of the live animal and eat it, which is cruel. You're not supposed to do that. If you're going to eat an animal, you got to kill it first. And that's what he would accuse his brothers of. And as a result, they killed an animal. That's kind of like a stab at Yosef's accusation. They killed an animal, ate the animal, and then used the blood, again, to dip Joseph's shirt into it, and that's how they faked his death. Yosef also accused his brothers of mistreating the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, who originally were slaves. They became Yaakov's wives, and then they had children from Yaakov, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. So Yosef accused the 6 children of Leah of mistreating the children of Bilhah and Zilpah and calling them slaves. And again, midah keneged midah, later on, Yosef himself was sold as a slave. And the other thing is we see that the Torah, Rashi tells us that Yosef accused his brothers of sexual misconduct. And lo and behold, Yosef got accused and imprisoned on a false allegation of attempted rape. So that's, we see the midah keneged midah with respect to Yosef, and we see it also with Yehuda. Yehuda dipped Yosef's shirt in blood in order to identify him to Yaakov. And then later on, Yehuda himself was identified by his coat. Also, Yehuda used a goat to fake Yosef's death. They killed the goat, they ate the goat, and then they used the blood to fake Yosef's death. And Yosef was deceived by Tamar because he promised her a payment of goats. She took the collateral instead of the goats, and so on. And we see later on, when that happens, Rashi tells us Yehuda realized right away, I'm getting repaid for what I did to Yosef. And that's why it was so embarrassing to him. And the other thing is we see that Yehuda withheld his son from Tamar. And as a result, he himself ended up being Tamar's husband. So again, there's your midah keneged midah. Another common thread that I see here is, and this is where I think there's a major lesson, the concept of honesty. In modern day, in modern times, we have this phrase, this catchphrase, honesty is the best policy. Well, no, it's not. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it isn't. And the Torah here is telling us when it is and when it isn't. So let's take a look, for example, when is it wrong to tell the truth? Well, Yosef, when this whole buildup of animosity and resentment happens between Yosef and his brothers, Yosef comes to his brothers and says, guess what, I had a dream. All of us were tying bundles of hay, and my bundle stood up suddenly, and your bundles surrounded mine and bowed to it. You can imagine how angry they got. Yes, it's true he had that dream, and turns out the interpretation of that dream, the implication was true. Yosef later on ended up the second in command in Egypt, and his brothers bowed to him. But was it necessary for Yosef to tell his brothers that? Is it necessary to brag? When you're bragging, even if it's true, it's not always necessary. And sometimes it's a bad thing, as we see in this particular case. The other thing that Yosef did was he ratted his brothers out in a situation where the commentaries imply that Yosef was wrong or mistaken about what he was telling his father about the brothers. But the point is, sometimes when you say bad things about people and it doesn't have a practical purpose, there's no need. Gossip, even if it's true, the Hebrew word is lashon hara, which literally translated means evil speech, evil talk. People often translate that as slander. Well, it's not slander, because slander means something that's not true. Lashon hara, by its very definition, is something that's true. So when you say something bad about someone, and then you hear someone say, oh, you can't do that, that's lashon hara, Often you'll hear someone say, but it's true. But that's what makes it Lashon Hara. You're not supposed to say something bad about someone, even if it's true. And this is what Yosef was doing to his brothers. So we see that those two things, the bragging and the Lashon Hara, what was the result of that? Yosef ended up being sold as a slave. On the other hand, we have the story of Tamar. When Yehuda impregnated Tamar, Yehuda sleeps with Tamar, he moves on, and he can't find her later on, but she gets pregnant. And later on, she's accused of adultery. Remember, she's supposed to be Shelah's wife. And here she is pregnant. And the local townsmen came to Yehuda, whom they saw as the elder, and they asked him, what do we do with Tamar? She's your daughter-in-law, and she seems to have committed adultery. And Yehuda recommends, listen, it's death penalty. And they're going to execute her. And rather than say to Yehuda, well, you're the one, guess what? It was you. She doesn't do that. What she does is she lays out the collateral that Yehuda gave her and says to him, if you can identify whom this belongs to, that's the person who made me pregnant. And Yehuda is the one who identifies himself. She never comes out and accuses him, because when you're accused of something bad, the defense, oh, you did something bad also, is not a valid defense. So Tamar is looking at that, and there's no point in humiliating Yehuda. Again, it has no practical purpose. So bottom line is she clammed up, right? And because of that, what was her reward? The dynasty of King David came from her. Yehuda, on the other hand, he stepped up. Now we see a situation where the truth is the best policy. When you got to own up to something that you did. Okay? Yehuda, in one situation, he didn't own up to what he did. Yehuda never came to Yaakov and said, listen, Father, I have to tell you something terrible. We sold Yosef as a slave. He let Yaakov believe for 22 years that Yosef was actually killed. And you know what the result of that was? When Yehuda pretty much he stopped his brothers from killing Yosef, they turned on him for it. They said, you know something? You should have stopped us from selling him also. And Rashi tells us, when the Torah says that Yehuda left his father's home, the message here is he left because his brothers rejected him. His brothers rejected Yehuda for not having gone further in stopping them from harming Yosef. And that was sort of a punishment. He could have simply owned up, but he didn't. And he gets rejected by his brothers. On the other hand, when he does own up to what happened, the story with Tamar. Tamar lays out the collateral, and Yehuda looks at it and says, yes, you're right. You're right, it was me. It's from me. And one of the interpretations of that is the word "it's from me" isn't Yehuda talking. It's not the Torah quoting Yehuda. It's the Torah, the author of the Torah, God, saying, this whole thing came from me. Because Tamar did something righteous. And Yehuda now did something righteous. And because of that, their offspring will lead to King David. So this is what happens when Yehuda owns up. And I have to mention something that a friend pointed out to me a while ago, that the difference between King David and King Saul, if you look at their history, King Saul lost the dynasty. Why? Because when King Saul was accused by Shmuel, the prophet, of not carrying out instructions, two things he did wrong. One, he prepared to go forward with a war without waiting for Shmuel to show up. Shmuel gave him instructions, and the instructions came from God. Don't make a move until I show up in the preparations for the war. And Shaul got nervous because Shmuel wasn't showing up, and he went ahead and started the sacrifices that generally are done before you go to war. Shmuel shows up and says, what have you done? And Shaul doesn't own what he did. He doesn't say, yes, I was wrong. What he says, he defends it. He says, but we were getting nervous. The enemy's numbers were climbing and our numbers were dwindling, and I wanted to make sure that we go to war before they have the upper hand. He didn't own up. And again, when Shmuel instructs Shaul on God's command, on God's instructions, he says to him, when you go to war with Amalek, you kill all of them. Everything, you wipe it out. You don't leave a remnant of Amalek. And Shaul left two things remaining. He left behind all of their cattle. He left it alive, and he captured it. And the king of Amalek, Agag. Shmuel shows up and says, "What have you done?" And again, Shaul doesn't say, "Oh, yes, I was wrong." What he does is, later on, he says he was wrong for not destroying the cattle. But at first, again, he defends it. He says, but I saved all the cattle so that we can use them as sacrifices to God. And I saved Agag so that the whole world can see him as a trophy, as a tribute. Look, God gave us victory. But Shmuel says to him, don't think on God's behalf. God gave you instructions, carry out the instructions. And because Shaul, rather than owning up to his mistake, he excused it, Shmuel says, your dynasty will be gone when you're gone. Your son will not inherit the throne. King David, on the other hand, he had an affair with a married woman, with Bathsheba. When he found out Bathsheba was pregnant, he connived to have Bathsheba's husband killed. And when the prophet Nathan points out to David what he had done, David says, oh my goodness, I have sinned. I deserve to be killed. That was it. He regretted it, he repented, and he accepted punishment. And for that, he was forgiven. He was still punished. He wasn't killed, but he was punished. But his dynasty survived. And his dynasty will survive forever. There's a difference when you own up. When you own up, there's always redemption. Yes, there's punishment, but there's redemption. And that's one of the messages that we see in several situations between Yosef and Yehuda. And finally, we see another time where you're supposed to tell the truth. And this connects to Hanukkah, and I'll explain next week how. Always tell the truth. When you're telling a message that comes from God. When Yosef was interpreting the dream that when you interpreted the dream that the head of the Pharaoh's winery had, it was good news. It's very good to tell somebody good news. Guess what? In 3 days, Pharaoh's going to take up your case, and he's going to review it, and he's going to find you not guilty. He's going to give you back your position. Wonderful. But then the head of the bakery got not such good news. In 3 days, Pharaoh's going to review your case, and he's going to decide he's going to sentence you to death. You're going to get executed. Where did Joseph get the answer, the interpretation of this dream? He didn't figure it out himself. He didn't make it up. God gave him that information. And when God gives you information to give someone, you say it exactly as is. You never switch up something that God tells you. And that, which I will discuss next week, early next week, that's the message of Hanukkah. Thank you for watching. Again, if you like the video, click like. Feel free to share it. Feel free to post comments. Feel free to post your own videos or just post something that's not a video. Thank you again, and Shabbat Shalom.